Welcome, dear listener, to another journey back through the mists of time. As the modern world fades away, allow your mind to settle into the gentle embrace of history's forgotten moments. Tonight, we'll explore the peculiar and often surprising realities of medieval royal life, a world both magnificent and strange, where golden crowns concealed very human struggles. This tale is crafted especially to help you unwind, to let the tensions of your day dissolve as we wander through castle corridors and royal chambers of centuries past. The rhythms of history have a way of soothing our modern minds, reminding us that all troubles, like all glories, eventually pass into memory. I'm always delighted to know where in our wide world you're listening from. Perhaps you're settling into bed as evening falls, or maybe you're seeking a moment of calm during your busy day. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, in your corner of the world, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. It brings me such joy to see our community of history lovers gather from across the globe. If these journeys into the past bring you comfort or fascination, consider subscribing so you won't miss our next adventure through time. Each story is a doorway to another era, waiting for you to step through. Now, let us leave behind the electric lights and digital screens of our time. Close your eyes if you wish, and follow me to a world of candlelight and stone, of silk and steel, of immense privilege and surprising hardship, the curious realm of medieval royalty. The first pale light of dawn crept through the narrow windows of Prince Edward's bedchamber, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny courtiers in the air. Though the prince still slumbered beneath layers of embroidered blankets and fur coverlets, his chamber had already sprung to life with activity. 6 servants moved with practiced silence around the enormous canopied bed, each performing tasks that had been carried out in precisely the same manner for generations. "The fire must be built higher," whispered the chamberlain to a young page who immediately scurried to add more logs to the hearth. His Highness complained of the cold yesterday morning. Near the doorway, Father Benedict stood with 2 acolytes, quietly murmuring Latin prayers while sprinkling holy water in each corner of the room. This daily blessing was believed to ward off evil spirits that might bring illness or misfortune to the royal body. Meanwhile, at a small table by the window, the royal food taster, a thin man named Giles, whose face bore the permanent expression of someone anticipating disaster, carefully sampled each dish from the prince's breakfast tray: a morsel of bread, a spoonful of honeyed porridge, a sip of watered wine. His life was the living guarantee of the prince's safety, for any poison would claim him first. Prince Edward stirred beneath his coverings, and instantly the room fell silent. The young royal was not yet 16 years old, but the elaborate ritual surrounding his awakening was already as fixed and formal as if he were the king himself. "Good morning, your highness," said the chamberlain, with a deep bow as the prince's eyes fluttered open. "The day promises fair weather, and your lord father the king requests your presence at court by the hour of terce." Edward nodded sleepily, allowing 2 attendants to help him from the bed, while another brought a silver basin of rose-scented water for washing. No royal hand would touch its own face without assistance. No princely foot would reach for its own slipper. By mid-morning, King Henry himself sat upon an ornate chair in the castle's great hall, his face a mask of patience as a line of commoners shuffled forward one by one. "For the king's touch," explained an elderly courtier to a visiting merchant from Florence, "is known throughout Christendom to cure the king's evil." The Italian watched with undisguised fascination as a mother brought her scrofula-afflicted child before the monarch. With solemn dignity, King Henry placed his hands upon the child's swollen neck, murmuring prayers while pressing a gold coin into the small palm. "The royal touch has healed thousands," continued the courtier proudly. "It is God's blessing upon our sovereign's bloodline, proof of divine favor upon his rule." The visiting merchant nodded politely, though his eyes betrayed skepticism. "And these people," he asked quietly, "they truly believe they are cured?" The courtier's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "It would be most unwise," he replied in measured tones, "to question the miracle of the royal touch within these walls. Such doubts might be considered treasonous." The merchant quickly composed his features into an expression of appropriate reverence, suddenly aware of how dangerous casual conversation could be in this glittering court. Prince Edward, now dressed in velvet and fur-trimmed garments that weighed nearly as much as he did, entered the great hall and approached his father's throne. The complex choreography of court etiquette immediately became apparent. The prince stopped precisely 7 paces from the king, bowed to an exact depth, neither too shallow to show proper respect, nor too deep to diminish his own status, and waited to be acknowledged. No one spoke. No one moved. The entire hall held its collective breath until the king nodded, almost imperceptibly, granting his son permission to approach further. "You must never turn your back on His Majesty," Lady Margaret whispered to her daughter, a newly appointed lady-in-waiting who stood nervously at the edge of the hall. "When leaving the royal presence, you must walk backward to the door, maintaining your curtsy. And remember, child, never raise your gaze above the king's shoulder unless directly commanded to do so." The girl nodded, her eyes wide with the terrifying responsibility of remembering hundreds of such rules, any one of which, if broken, could disgrace her family and end her promising position at court. Even breathing seemed governed by protocol. When King Henry spoke, courtiers held their breath to hear his words. When he laughed, the entire court erupted in appreciative mirth, regardless of whether they had heard the jest. When he frowned, faces fell in sympathetic concern. It was as if the very air of the room belonged to the monarch, and all present merely borrowed it with his permission. "The king is not merely a man," the Lord Chancellor often reminded new members of the court. "He is the living embodiment of the realm itself. His body is sacred, his words divine, his will the very will of God upon this earth." As the day progressed toward the midday meal, servants transformed the great hall. Tables appeared as if by magic, arranged in strict hierarchical order. The high table upon a dais for the royal family and highest nobles, lesser tables below for those of decreasing rank. The distance from the king's seat was measured not in feet but in degrees of honor, with each place setting a visible representation of its occupant standing in the intricate social order of the realm. The royal feast began with a thunderous fanfare of trumpets, announcing each course as if heralding the arrival of foreign dignitaries. First came the subtleties, elaborate sugar sculptures depicting scenes from the lives of saints and heroes, too beautiful to be consumed, yet too impressive not to display. Then arrived the centerpiece that drew gasps from even the most seasoned courtiers, a magnificent peacock, roasted to perfection, its iridescent feathers carefully removed before cooking and meticulously reattached afterward, creating the illusion that the bird remained alive in all its splendor. "A feast for the eyes before it becomes a feast for the belly," murmured Lord Pembroke to his neighbor, who nodded appreciatively at the spectacle. Before the king would taste a single morsel, Gilbert, the royal food taster, performed his solemn duty. With practiced movements that were both ceremonial and practical, he sampled each dish presented to the monarch, waiting several minutes between bites to ensure no poison would take effect. "The most dangerous position at court," whispered a young squire to his companion. "Yet Gilbert has survived 15 years in service." The taster's weathered face betrayed no emotion as he methodically worked through the king's portion, his very existence a reminder of the constant threats that surrounded those who wore crowns. The feast reached its climactic moment when servants carried in an enormous pie, setting it before the king with great ceremony. As the royal carver pierced the golden crust, Dozens of small birds, finches and larks, burst forth in a flurry of wings and song, soaring toward the rafters while nobles applauded the spectacle. Children of the court squealed with delight, while the king himself offered a rare smile at the theatrical display. Behind this moment of wonder lay days of preparation. Birds carefully inserted into hidden chambers within the pie just before serving, the pastry designed with secret compartments that would not collapse during baking, yet would yield easily to the carver's knife. Far from this opulence, Brother Thomas worked in the monastery kitchens that supplied bread for the royal household. Through a small window, he observed the procession of delicacies entering the castle gates. Exotic fruits from distant lands, spices worth more than a peasant might earn in years, wines from vineyards across the known world. Our Lord ate simply, breaking bread with fishermen, he remarked to Brother Matthew as they shaped loaves for the monastery's evening meal. Yet those who claim to rule in his name feast like emperors while children starve in the village. Brother Thomas had once served in the castle kitchens before taking his vows, and often spoke of the contrast between the mountains of food prepared for noble tables and the meager portions that sustained the common folk. They say the king consumes 22 dishes at each sitting, continued Brother Thomas, kneading dough with strong, practiced hands, while most of his subjects consider themselves fortunate to have pottage and bread. The monastery itself represented a middle path, neither the extravagance of the nobility nor the deprivation of peasants. Their meals were simple but sufficient: fresh bread, vegetables from their gardens, occasional fish from the river, and on feast days, perhaps a roasted chicken. God sees what fills both belly and heart, Brother Matthew replied softly, his eyes on the distant castle towers visible beyond the monastery walls. In a chamber far removed from both feast hall and monastery kitchen, 12-year-old Princess Eleanor sat motionless as her mother supervised the fitting of her wedding clothes. "You must make an impression when you meet King Alfonso," the queen instructed, circling her daughter with critical eyes. "The Spanish court expects magnificence, and you shall not disappoint them." Eleanor's face remained carefully composed, as she had been taught since infancy, but her small hands trembled slightly as they smoothed the heavy brocade of her gown. The princess had known of this arrangement since her 9th birthday, a marriage alliance that would bind 2 kingdoms and, hopefully, prevent war. Yet the reality of departure now loomed just weeks away. "Will I ever return home, Mother?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely audible as the seamstresses pinned and measured. The queen paused, then placed a formal kiss on her daughter's forehead. "Your home will be in Castile now, with your lord husband. You go to become a queen someday, Eleanor. Remember your bloodline and your duty." No mention was made of King Alfonso's 46 years, his 2 previous wives, or the reports of his stern demeanor. Such considerations were irrelevant to matters of state. The princess nodded obediently, swallowing the knot of fear in her throat as she had been taught a princess must always do. As autumn yielded to winter, the castle's grand appearance began to reveal its practical shortcomings. Massive stone walls that had provided protection from summer heat now held the cold like ice cellars. Tapestries hung not merely for decoration, but as essential barriers against drafts that whistled through arrow slits and window embrasures. Even in the royal chambers, where the finest Flemish hangings covered every wall and servants maintained fires throughout the day and night, the king could see his breath misting in the morning air. "More wood," he would command, though the forest reserves dwindled alarmingly as winter deepened. The royals wrapped themselves in furs and velvets, moved their beds closer to hearths, and still shivered through the long nights. Meanwhile, in the castle kitchens, laundries, and bakeries, servants paradoxically found themselves in the most comfortable spaces of the fortress. Dozens of bodies crowded together, combined with the constant heat of work fires, created pockets of warmth that made these lowly quarters more comfortable than the grand staterooms above. "The king may have his crown," joked a kitchen boy as he curled up near the massive ovens where bread baked through the night, "but we have the warmth." Such words, had they been overheard by the wrong ears, might have been considered treasonous, but in the servants' quarters, such small rebellions provided necessary comfort. The bitter winter winds howled outside the castle walls, finding every crack and crevice in the ancient stonework. In the royal chambers, King Henry sat hunched before a roaring fire, 3 thick fur cloaks draped around his shoulders, his fingers stiff with cold despite the gloves he wore indoors. Tapestries hung on every wall, yet still the drafts found their way through, making the flames dance and flicker. The king's breath formed visible clouds in the air as he spoke to his counselors, who stood shivering despite their formal stoicism. "Perhaps your majesty might consider moving court to the southern palace until the worst of winter passes," suggested Lord Pembroke, his voice quavering slightly from the cold. "Nonsense," the king replied, though his teeth nearly chattered. "My father weathered 23 winters in this castle, and I shall do the same. The people must see that their king endures what they endure." Yet even as he spoke these noble words, King Henry knew that few of his subjects lived in chambers vast and difficult to heat, with ceilings so high that all warmth rose far above where any human might benefit from it. The sound of jingling bells announced the arrival of Pocket, the court fool, who cartwheeled into the chamber without waiting for formal permission to enter. His motley costume of red and yellow seemed a splash of impossible summer in the gray winter gloom. Make way for the true ruler of the castle," he cried, bowing with exaggerated deference, not to the king, but to the fire itself. "King Flame, whose subjects grow more numerous by the day." Where any other man would have been severely punished for such impertinence, the king merely sighed. "What nonsense do you bring today, Pocket? I have matters of state to discuss." "Matters of state, while your royal backside freezes to the throne." Pocket danced around the chamber, his bells jingling merrily. "I bring news from below, sire. The kitchen boys sleep in shifts beside the ovens, fighting for the warmest spots. The laundry maids sing and tell stories in rooms thick with steam and laughter. Even the stable boys have found clever ways to nest in the hay near the great horses, stealing their warmth." He leaned in conspiratorially toward the king. "They say the true palace is below, where the work is hard but the air is warm." Lord Pembroke's face flushed with indignation. "Such insolence! Your Majesty, this fool forgets his place." "No, my lord," the king said quietly. "Pocket never forgets his place. It is precisely because he knows his place that he may speak thus." He turned to the jester. "Continue, fool. What else do they say below stairs?" Pocket's painted face grew suddenly serious, the transformation startling in its completeness. "They say the king grows old before his time, carrying burdens no man should bear alone. They say he shivers in his grand chambers while signing death warrants and planning wars. They wonder if his crown keeps his head warm at night." He approached the king and, in a gesture no other would dare, placed his hand briefly on the royal shoulder. They wonder if he remembers what it was to be simply a man. The counselors gasped at this liberty, but King Henry raised his hand to silence their protests. For several long moments, the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the distant moan of wind through stone corridors. "Leave us," the king finally commanded. "All but Pocket." The counselors bowed and backed away, shooting venomous glances at the fool who had been granted a private audience. When they were alone, King Henry's shoulders slumped, the weight of his 62 years suddenly visible in every line of his body. "Do you know, Pocket, that I have not felt truly warm in 15 years, not since the fever that nearly took me to the grave." He stared into the flames. "Sometimes I think I did die then, and everything since has been some strange half-life. a ghost king ruling a kingdom that grows more distant by the day. Then perhaps your majesty should visit the kitchens, Pocket suggested, his voice gentler now. There is life there, and warmth to spare. The king laughed, a rusty sound rarely heard in the royal chambers. Can you imagine? The King of England, huddled with scullery maids and pot boys. I can imagine a man seeking warmth where it may be found, Pocket replied. The crown may separate you from other men, but the cold treats all flesh equally. Later that night, as snow fell heavily outside, King Henry stood alone in his private chapel. The royal chronicler had departed hours ago, after dutifully recording the day's official events and decisions. None would record these private moments when the king knelt painfully on the cold stone floor, his jeweled crown placed before him on the altar steps. I have built 7 monasteries, he whispered to the darkness, endowed 12 hospitals, won 3 great battles, and sired 5 living children. Yet what remains when the cold seeps into my bones? What will they remember when I am gone? The chapel offered no answer but the echo of his own voice. In the silence that followed, King Henry contemplated the great tomb that was already prepared for him in Westminster Abbey, with its marble effigy showing him in eternal youth and strength, crowned firmly on his head, scepter in hand. How different from the stiff-jointed, gray-bearded man who now struggled to rise from his knees without assistance. As dawn approached, the king made his way not back to his bedchamber, but down the winding servants' stairs. The guards who followed at a discreet distance exchanged puzzled glances, but said nothing, as their sovereign, wrapped in a simple dark cloak, pushed open the door to the castle kitchens. There, amid the organized chaos of bread-making and the preparation of the day's first meals, King Henry stood unrecognized for several blessed minutes, absorbing the warmth, the laughter, the simple humanity that his exalted position had long denied him. A young kitchen maid finally noticed him and dropped her bowl with a clatter, falling to her knees. The warmth and chatter instantly died as everyone followed suit. The king sighed, feeling the brief moment of connection slip away. "Rise," he commanded gently. "Continue your work. I merely—" He paused, searching for words that a king could say to explain such an unprecedented visit. "I merely wished to see that all was in order for the day's meals." As he turned to leave, dignity requiring a swift retreat from this impulsive act, he caught sight of Pocket seated comfortably on a flour sack in the corner, observing everything with knowing eyes. The fool raised an invisible toast to his king, a gesture of understanding that no one else noticed. In that moment, King Henry understood that while his legacy in the chronicles might be of battles won and cathedrals built, the true measure of his reign and his humanity might lie in these unrecorded moments when the man behind the crown sought the simple warmth that all beings crave.